Peter Attia's book, Outlive, just turned 1 year old, and I wanted to use this as an opportunity to discuss all the amazing learnings I got out of this book, as well as the actionable things that I took out of the book that are going to improve my health span and lifespan. If you have read Outlive, I hope this video reminds you of some of the key items in it that you can bring into your own life. And if you haven't, I recommend you go grab it. But if you're not going to get to it for a while, I think this video will be the next best thing. Before we get to the actionable items from Outlive that are going to help you live longer and better, I just want to mention who Peter Attia is. Peter Attia is an educator, a scientist, and a doctor who is focusing on medicine that is making people live the best, longest lives possible. A lot of his clients are very high net worth individuals that go to him to be able to live the longest, best lives they can. The good news is, if you don't want to shell out the $100,000 a year it takes to be his patient, he's put a lot of this information in this book, so we can still get a lot of those same insights. As we get started discussing this book, I think it's really important to go over some of the baseline ideas that lay the foundation for everything else that we're going to discuss later. The first one of those is that we must all have agency over our own health and well-being. In the end of the day, we can go to doctors, we can go to trainers, we can get the best meal programs, but we're the ones that have to implement it. So you are the one who's going to need to do and take all the action that we'll be discussing later. This in no means we should be questioning doctors, but I think it means that we should be educated enough to have a more nuanced conversation about our own health, well-being, and also make sure that we have enough information to find a doctor or practitioner that's aligned with our values and our goals. Now let's talk about some of the key concepts and definitions that Peter outlines in Outlive that will allow us again to have that baseline as we go to the more actionable steps. The first of that is a term that Peter coins, Healthspan. Healthspan is a metric that's not only looking about how long you are living, but also the quality of your life during that time. I like to visualize Healthspan as a graph where the horizontal axis is the length of our life, which would be our kind of lifespan. How long do we want to live? And the vertical axis is the quality of our life, which would be everything from our blood markers to our physical abilities, to just having the flexibility and mobility to do the things that we want and love every day. And our goal with Healthspan is not just to maximize how far we get on this graph, but the area under the curve of our lives, which is accounting for the quality during that time. I, for one, rather live 80 amazing years being able to do the things I love until I die than 100 years where the last 50 of those, I'm really not able to do the things that I love. And that is really the key concept of Healthspan that will keep coming up again during this conversation. The second concept that I want to discuss before we get to some of the juicier stuff is the term Medicine 3.0. Medicine 2.0 is the current paradigm of medicine where we really wait for people that get sick and then we give them drugs or things to help them get better from there. But unfortunately, a lot of times, a lot of the damage is already done to the internal workings of their body. So we're kind of fighting back towards a baseline where Medicine 3.0 is focusing on prevention of disease in the first place, as well as personalized medicine that's trying to combat any ailments or issues long before they happen and keeping our bodies in pristine working order as long as possible. Medicine 2.0 is a fundamentally flawed concept, especially as we understand more about the body and health. And a few analogies that I think speak to this well are a car without a speedometer, and you only get a speedometer when you've had 2 out of 3 tickets that you're going to lose your license. So you have no idea what speed you're going, you get a couple speeding tickets, and now when you're on your final last straw, you get a speedometer, and now any mistake you make is fatal and you lose your license permanently. This sets us up so that that last speeding ticket has big consequences that largely could have been avoided if we had a speedometer all along. The second analogy that really speaks to the inner engineer in me is that if we just did no maintenance on complicated systems like cars and planes, where we waited for the car to completely break down before taking it in to try to fix it. At this point, the engine might be blown, all the gaskets are leaking. Instead of just doing some oil changes and some preventative maintenance of this car, this plane, now we have kind of drastic issues that require a lot more effort and work to fix. Now that we have a little bit of background on some of the terminology and key points here that Peter discusses in Outlive, I want to discuss about the most impactful things from this book that I think about now every day in my own life, and have led to a lot of changes that I've made for myself personally. The first of these things is what Peter Attia calls the 4 horsemen. These are the 4 diseases that are responsible for a vast majority of deaths. It is 80% of people in America over the age of 50 are going to die of these 4 things, which I had no idea. This leads me to be able to really tailor my approach to health, just focusing on avoiding these diseases with everything that I have, knowing that I'm going to get the most bang for my buck for the effort I'm putting in. These 4 diseases are heart disease, which is things like heart attacks and strokes. You have metabolic dysfunction, which is really encompassing things like diabetes. Then you have cancer, and then finally you have neurological diseases like Alzheimer's. Understanding the prevalence of these diseases allows us to take this medicine 3.0 approach to our health, where we're focusing on prevention of these diseases specifically to get the most bang for our buck. With that existential dread of death on the mind, let's talk about the single most potent drug we know for longevity and health span, and that is exercise. Peter goes into a lot of detail on how exercise is the most potent longevity drug and discusses how it not only decreases our chances of all the 4 horsemen diseases of death, but also gives us a lot of benefits to our quality of life, which is increasing that health span side of the equation. Research has shown that going from 0 to 90 minutes of exercise decreases all-cause mortality by over 14%, and there's a dose response here that goes well beyond that. So right now, the current research shows the more you exercise, the more you're reducing your all-cause mortality. This data is absolutely mind-blowing to me. This is even more amazing when we realize that 77% of Americans are not getting adequate exercise, and shows how exercise is the single biggest lever we have to increase the health of our overall society and also decrease healthcare costs drastically. If we could bottle up exercise into a pill, it would absolutely blow away any pharmacological tool that we have currently, which just goes to show how amazing this is and how critical it is that you implement exercise in your daily life. Now let's talk about how that exercise might look based on what Peter Attia mentions in Outlive. He breaks down exercise into 4 distinct pillars. The first one is our cardiovascular base health, which is also called Zone 2 training. This is training where we're going to be running or jogging or biking or doing any cardio in a kind of low, steady state intensity level. In my mind, the best way to know if you're in zone 2 is if you can just barely hold a conversation with someone at this steady state intensity. So if you're able to get on the phone and call someone, you might have labored breath, but hold that conversation. That means you're probably in zone 2. If that conversation is super easy, you probably need to ramp up the intensity a little. And if you're just struggling for breath, you probably want to just slow things down. For me, I've also found this is around 145 beats per minute for me on most days. So I'll also use that to make sure that I'm kind of in that zone 2 range, where zone 2 is really the base of our cardiovascular abilities. The next key pillar is really focusing on the peak of this pyramid, which is VO2 max, or an extremely high intensity anaerobic output. In Outlive, Peter mentions how VO2 max is the single best predictor of your cardiovascular health, and that also means one of the single best predictors of your overall lifespan and health span potential. Peter then goes on to state that going from a bottom 25th percentile to upper 75th percentile in terms of VO2 max is decreasing the risk of all-cause mortality by around 70%. This demonstrates how this is such an important metric for overall health and lifespan. The next pillar of exercise is strength, which is pretty self-explanatory, but before reading Outlive, I did not appreciate how important it is to build muscle mass and strength when we're younger, as we age, our ability to increase our strength and build muscle falls off drastically. Peter makes a great analogy that this is like retirement savings. We know at some point we're not going to want to work or not have the ability to work, so we need to save today for that time. And similarly, banking away muscle mass and strength today is going to help us drastically in the future when it's going to be harder to create these kind of adaptations. A second example of why muscle mass and strength is so important is that as we age, falls become a very big issue. For example, if someone has a broken hip, I think over the age of 55 or 60, their risk of dying increases 2 to 3 times. Anything that we can do to prevent falling, prevent broken bones later in life is going to pay big dividends on our Healthspan potential in those later years of life. The final pillar of exercise that Peter mentions, which I'm really glad he did, is stability training. This is something that's often neglected and something that I personally always need to emphasize more in my own training, is the ability for our bodies to move well and have mobility and stability in the end ranges of motion that we're going to be using. This is going to help with our strength training. It's obviously going to help with our balance and that fall prevention, and just ensuring that our muscles and our bodies are well balanced, which will prevent a lot of injuries from overuse or being in non-optimal positions. These are the 4 pillars of exercise as Peter mentions them, and he ties it all together into his training program, which is really training for what he calls the Centurion Olympics, which is the key things that he wants to be able to do when he's at this kind of 100-year-old age. This might be activities like picking up your grandchild or picking up a suitcase into an overhead compartment in a plane. These key things that we want to be able to do in our old age can allow us to tailor our training around these goals. Specifically for me, I love the mountains, hiking, climbing, and adventure. And being able to hike 4 or 5 miles is something I want to be able to do as long as possible. So that's a big emphasis in my training, as well as travel is something I really love. So being able to travel independently in my old age, like lifting up that suitcase, being able to have the mobility to get around, are things that I'm going to really focus my training on as I get older. When it comes to the frequency of these different trainings, Peter aims to get 4 sessions in zone 2 cardio of around 45 minutes each. He's trying to do at least 1 VO2 max session per week, which looks like a kind of 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off session of 30 minutes or so, where that 4 minutes on is the most intense output you can possibly do for 4 minutes. And that 4 minutes off is like a very low intensity jog or something that's just keeping the heart rate up. And then he'll be aiming also for 3 to 4 strength sessions per week, which is aiming at lower rep range, kind of more compound movements, aiming to increase our overall muscle mass and strength. Now that we understand how important exercise is and the different modalities of exercise we have in our tool chest to increase health span, let's talk about metabolic health, as this is something that I was just not super aware of or even thinking about going into reading this book, and something that I have been much more cognizant of ever since. When I talk about metabolic health, I'm mostly talking about our glucose control mechanism and how sensitive our body is in this domain. An example from the book is a healthy individual only has a teaspoon of glucose in the blood at any given time, and our body titrates this to precise amounts. Only a 1/4 teaspoon more of glucose in our entire bloodstream in our bodies constitutes prediabetes, which is incredible how sensitive and precise this system is, and really shows that we really need to take care of this. Just a small change in glucose levels circulating around the body leads to a lot of damage in our arteries, which is increasing our risk of heart disease like stroke and heart attacks. So anything we can do to keep the system in working order is going to have big outcomes in reduction in risk of heart disease. Keeping our metabolism healthy and our glucose and insulin levels in check not only helps heart disease, but actually has a 4 to 12 times reduction in cancer risk, a 3 to 5 times reduction in Alzheimer's risk, and then a 4 to 6 times reduction in heart disease risk. So keeping our metabolic health in check is really another lever like exercise that is helping reduce our risk of all these horseman diseases. We've already talked about the number 1 tool in regulating our blood glucose levels, which is exercise, but Peter also mentions in Outlive how we can measure this with devices like continuous glucose monitors that measure this throughout the day, or even a simpler version. What I've implemented is a little standard glucose monitor where I'm pricking my finger oftentimes in the morning after different meals and understanding how different food types impact my glucose and just seeing how my glucose might change over time. Another key tool we have to regulate our glucose and blood sugar levels is diet. Peter Attia purposely does not go into a ton of specifics when it comes to diet, as we all know the tribalistic tendencies that come when we discuss one diet versus another. And I really think he wants to avoid this invoking any tribal warfare amongst readers. So he really keeps the diet stuff high level. He also explains how dietary research is not super robust, as controlling people's diets for long periods of time is just not practical, and people's self-reported eating habits are oftentimes very different from what they're eating in actuality. So instead of focusing on a specific diet of eat this or eat that, we're going to really focus on a few key concepts here. The first one, which is by far the most important, is that we need to focus on energy balance first. The leading cause of metabolic dysfunction is just eating too much and having too much input calories versus output calories. This means your body's eventually going to gain weight and your glucose regulation system is going to get worse and worse. So we really want to focus on calories in versus calories out here. Obviously, this takes into account your exercise and activity, and we want to have a energy balance that is meeting our goals. That could be we want to gain weight, that could mean that we want to maintain our weight, or that means we want to lose weight. And calories in versus calories out has some subtlety there, but it is a fine heuristic for the level of this discussion. The second one is just don't be too dogmatic about any diet. Peter mentions in the book how he used to be a big proponent of the ketogenic diet and has since backpedaled on that a little. In my opinion, anytime anyone goes too crazy one direction when it comes to diet, it's probably no longer optimal. The next thing we can focus on is getting adequate protein, which is an essential macronutrient building block of our muscles. Especially if we're exercising, if we're trying to maintain or grow muscle mass, we want to really make sure that we have this dialed down. We want to get 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per pound body mass, especially if we're exercising a lot and trying to gain muscle mass. The next thing we want to get is adequate fiber. I aim for 30 to 40 grams a day, even though it's a struggle for me personally. And I forget if Peter calls this out specifically in Outlive, but it is extremely essential for our gut microbiome, which there's a lot of data shows actually support and regulate our blood sugar levels. And adequate fiber can actually reduce some of the bad cholesterol levels as well, and also help other aspects of health. In the end, the best thing we can do for diet is avoid what Peter calls the SAD, or standard American diet, where we want to avoid ultra-processed foods that are devoid of nutrients. We want to avoid sugary drinks like sodas and juices, and just have a balanced diet with some fruits and vegetables. Now that we have our exercise, metabolic health, and our diets in order, the next key thing to talk about is sleep. This is something that Peter mentions neglecting for many years, and in his residence days as a doctor, having this kind of sleep when I'm dead mentality, which is something I was definitely guilty of. But there's been so much research on sleep, especially in the last few years, that is showing the absolute importance of sleep across all domains of health. Sleep is the time when we form memories. It's the time when we release a majority of our growth hormone and our muscles and our bodies repair themselves. It's actually when our brain flushes all the toxins out of it, preventing things like Alzheimer's and neurological diseases. Sleep is so critical to our health and something that we cannot neglect. Some of my own faulty logic behind sleep came from trying to maximize my amount of time to do work, to do the things I love, when in reality, not all time is equal. I've noticed that when I started prioritizing sleep, I might have one less hour, but every single hour I do have is so much more productive. It's just so much better lived that oftentimes we need to sacrifice a little time for better quality of time. There's a ton of research on sleep and the impacts on some of the Horseman diseases. For example, they have deprived people of deep sleep in the lab, and this is shown to absolutely obliterate the glucose regulation system in the body and make people get to a pre-diabetic or diabetic level of glucose management after only, I think, 4 or 5 days of this reduction or elimination of deep sleep. In terms of how to get the best sleep, we want to aim for that 7.5 to 8.5 hours of sleep. We want to regulate our body temperature when we sleep. Our body actually wants to be cooler as it falls to sleep, so cooling down your environment is really important. Or counterintuitively, taking a hot shower or a sauna prior to sleep will get your body temperature up, and your body will compensate by dropping your core body temperature, so that can help better sleep. It's also good to avoid a big meal in the 2 to 3 hours before sleep. We want to avoid caffeine later on in the day. For me, caffeine after 1 really disrupts my sleep, so I try to have my last coffee of the day in that kind of 12:30 to 1:30 range. We want to make sure that there's no bright lights when we're sleeping, so blinds or an eye mask is really helpful. And also avoiding light prior to sleep, especially bluer hued lights. And the final thing that's really going to improve our sleep is giving our body a good sleep routine where we're unwinding and kind of engaging the parasympathetic nervous system prior to sleep. This means putting away the social media, putting away the work email, and slowly winding down towards sleep. The final concept that I thought was really important that Outlive dug into that's impacted my life is really a focus on emotional health. Peter concludes this book diving into how a neglect of emotional health almost cost him so many things in life. And I thought that his transparency here was extremely brave and kind of gave light to this really important thing that I feel like less people are talking about, especially in this longevity health scene where people are always trying to optimize biomarkers and things like this, often at the neglect of the whole and the big picture, which is your overall life quality and your overall emotional well-being. In my mind, like, what's the point of living an extra few years if you're spending that time just focus on some blood markers and going to sleep and neglecting the things that are fun and make life worth it? I think that this chapter is actually one of the most important ones that a lot of people are not talking about enough, but trying to build a healthy emotional state and overall a life that's worth living is more important than any of the focus on longevity. Once you have a life that you're healthy, you're happy, you have money stress out of the way, that's when I think you can really start optimizing this longevity stuff and like, I want to have more years of this. However, I think a lot of people don't have these kind of bases covered and they're trying to optimize things before having their life in a place where it's worth optimizing. Overall, a lot of the things we discussed, like exercise and diet, are going to help with emotional health indirectly. The moral here is have a life that's worth living longer. And Peter mentions going to therapy, getting exercise, getting like sunlight, being outside is some of the tools we have to make sure that this is taken care of. To take this back to our kind of curve looking at Healthspan, I like to think of this as another curve that's our overall happiness. And we're only able to realize the life that's like from the limiting curve. So we might have really good health, but if we're unhappy, we're not really getting the full life enjoyment out of that period of time. So this is something that we need to focus on as well as our health and everything else we've discussed today. That is the key takeaways from Outlive as someone who just read it. I've listened to Peter Attia's work for some time now, so included some snippets from his podcast, The Drive, and other things in here. But I think that these key things and some of these key concepts are so important, and I applaud Peter for making such an amazing book and continuing to educate people on these key domains. And I want to thank Peter for bringing these things like Medicine 3.0 into more everyday conversations. I hope that this helped remind you of some of the key things from Outlive if you haven't read it in a while, or if you haven't read the book, gave you some of the key concepts. I know this is fairly long-winded, but this book had so many key points, I feel like I needed some time to go over them. And if you enjoyed this and want to know more, give me a like and subscribe down below to give me that feedback. And if you want to dive into even more details on this exact discussion, I do have a blog article that I will link below that dives into this in even more detail. But with that, thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you implement some of the things that we discussed here today.